Hello everybody and welcome to the finale of this video series responding to, what's the video called? Male-Bodied People, a guide to transphobic arguments from Turf Island. And I do think it's worth reflecting on the fact that the video is called Male-Bodied People, and so far the only reference to male-bodied people is when Sheep said that the term male-bodied people means precisely nothing. And we all heard that and said, Sheep, what are you talking about? It very clearly, obviously does mean something quite substantial indeed. If I say I'm a male-bodied person, you know exactly what I mean. If I say I identify as a woman, I would say you have no idea what I mean, apart from just, as I always refer to it, an empty identity of just like, I identify as this because I identify as this. I'm not communicating any meaningful or substantial truth by saying I identify as a woman, or indeed that I identify as a man, unless by saying I identify as a man, what I mean is that I recognize that I am a male-bodied person, because male-bodied person very much does mean something. On the subject of reflecting on the series so far, I've already edited all the other videos now, and as I was editing, I kept like coming across other things where I was like, oh wait, there's another stupid thing said there. And I'm not sure how long this is going to be. This is actually probably going to be the shortest video, and I may therefore decide to go back and add in some like bonus stupid things that I realized during the editing process. But for now, we're just going to get towards the end of this video. And yeah, if we end up doing the bonus stupid things, then you can look forward to that. Otherwise, you can feel very sad that you only have 4 very substantial videos, but you don't have the extra addendums refuting this person. Anyway, so let's actually get ready to enjoy. So as you can see, we're on Somebody Please Think of the Children. So this is the section that's going to be talking about children. I'm not sure what's going to be said. I'm very excited. I just remembered, let's shut this thing down.
Pandering you have a drag queen story hour, to fear-mongering about gay school teachers being secret pedos, dating all the way back to the segregationist idea that black and white kids being in the same...
Okay, again, talking about race, whatever. Just, again, that weird obsession with race. But the main thing I want to touch on is, like, here's the thing about the whole won't somebody please think of the children thing, right? If you're going to use that as a criticism in and of itself, you're opening the door to not caring about children at all, right? Like, if your argument is just going to be, these people have concerns about children, therefore they're illegitimate, therefore their concerns are illegitimate, then how do you recognize legitimate concerns about the safety of children? You know, if you say these people are concerned about potential exposure to paedophilia amongst children, therefore their concerns are illegitimate, how will you actually ever be able to deal with when there genuinely is a risk of children being exposed to paedophilia? Or, for example, one of the criticisms of drag queen story hour is that drag is a quite sexualized thing. You know, and is it accurate to consider it sexualized? I'm not sure. But there is an argument that could be made that drag a lot of times is very sexual, and indeed quite often perhaps fetishistic, and that therefore to have children basically participate in that is maybe introducing something inappropriately sexual towards children. Now, you can disagree with that, but what you can't say is the fact that you're concerned about introducing something inappropriately sexual to children is a problem in itself. You can argue, well, it's not inappropriately sexual, but you can't say the very fact that somebody's concerned about this is in some way a reason to call them a bigot or something like that, because then you'd have to say, well, what if somebody was concerned in a case when it is something inappropriately sexual? In which case you'd then have to say, well, actually, there is no such thing as being inappropriately sexual towards children. I don't think it's unreasonable at all to say that if you're going to run with this whole think of the children narrative as always being insincere, always being an indication of bigotry, and never being something that should be taken seriously, you're writing a blank check to paedophilia. You know, you're saying, well, you know what, we're not going to be concerned about children at all. What matters, and this is the key point, isn't are people concerned about children? What matters is, are those concerns legitimate? To start off saying, well, the very fact that these people have concerns about children means that their concerns are illegitimate, as you just very clearly did then, Mr. Sheep, is not very good. And yeah, obviously, basically it would mean that we can't have legitimate concerns about children in any situation if you're going to argue that all concerns about children are in essence, illegitimate.
As some form of weapon against some of the most vulnerable people in our society, whilst ignoring child marriage and child beauty pageants, because it's mostly cis-het white conservatives doing that shit. The main
What? What? Yeah. Do you think that, like, the child pageant thing, I would almost probably say is not really a political issue. Like, on the one hand, maybe it's conservatives who are doing child pageants more often, but I could also equally very much imagine that, there are drag beauty pageants for little kids, and those are obviously not going to be frequented by conservatives. It seems to me like putting children in beauty pageants is pretty cross-political spectrum. Now, as for child marriage, being pro-child marriage isn't a conservative position. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't conservatives who are pro-child marriage. Obviously, lots of religious conservatives, Muslims most obviously, are pro-child marriage. For other religions, they might be pro-child marriage, but there's not as much reason for them to be pro-child marriage. Obviously, in Islam, Muhammad, the pattern of conduct for all men, married a 6-year-old, and then waited until she was 9 before he had sex with her. Conversely, in every other religion I'm aware of, there isn't such a very unambiguous kind of positive portrayal of child marriage. But the point is, drawing such a clear association between child marriage and conservatism is such a bad faith take. It's shocking. I get sometimes, I get comments saying, because every now and then I'll kind of razz on conservatives a bit, and then I'll get a comment from people who, are conservative, who agree with me on gender identity, disagree with me on lots of other stuff, saying, hey, why have you always got to be mean to conservatives? And yeah, sure, maybe I am a bit mean to conservatives, but I would never ever be like, well, obviously it's conservatives doing child marriage and therefore conservatives don't care about child marriage. That's such a bizarre thing to say. Conservatives aren't doing child marriage. Now, it is true that there is a small amount of child marriage happening in the Western world, and I suppose you could say that the majority of communities that are facilitating and allowing for that child marriage are conservative. But that's not really the thing that's implied by saying conservatives are doing child marriage, because in reality, conservatives as a collective aren't doing child marriage. Conservatives overwhelmingly are not doing that. And of course, also, the majority of conservatives, I think, are 100% against child marriage. The absolute absurdity, but I mean, and this is the real big thing, the ridiculous claim that child marriage is ignored. What are you on about? The reality is that child marriage, as far as I can tell, in the UK, isn't particularly common. It's not something I see very much happening. Therefore, I suppose in that sense, you could say I ignore it because it's not something which I talk about very much. It's not something that's really on my radar, but it's something I unambiguously oppose. It's something which loads of people, conservative, liberal, whatever else, unambiguously oppose. It's not really, in the kind of Western Overton window, a political issue. Sure, in some countries, it maybe is a political issue. Well, there are some radical reformers who want to, make it so that child marriage is illegal. But it's not a political issue here, you absolute lunatic. And of course, it's even more ridiculous when you consider the idea that, so gender-critical feminists are ignoring child marriage. And also, I mean, let's be honest here, gender-critical feminists ignoring child beauty pageants? This guy has no idea what he's talking about, and it's embarrassing. It's so just embarrassing and incoherent, nonsensical. That sentence was just insane. Just gender-critical feminists are ignoring child marriage because that's what conservatives do. And it's like, everything he just said in that sentence was wrong, as well, including the implication that there is some association between gender critical people and conservatives, or indeed that gender critical people are have a generally positive view of conservatives. Most gender critical people don't have positive views of conservatives, except for in the specific areas where they agree on gender identity. So very wrong, very embarrassing.
For a start, it's illegal to put children on HRT, and certainly illegal to perform gender confirmation surgery on them. So usually what
in my Sam Collins video, I had several people commenting saying, actually, you can just have this surgery in the US. And to be honest, even Sam Collins admitted that that this is the thing that can happen. First of all, admitting that you can go onto hormones when you're, below the age of consent, if you like, when you're a minor. But then also saying that you can even get top surgery, aka, mutilation of your chest, when you're a minor as well, if you have like parental consent. So yeah, it's just not true to claim that this isn't happening.
Puberty blockers, which are essentially harmless and, well, as the name might imply, block puberty and give the trans kid a good long time to think about and really genuinely consider whether or not transitioning is the best option for them.
I mean, the question there is harmless. Well, I mean, it kind of depends what you mean by harmless. Lots of people would say that stunting your development is a harmful thing. Like, if somebody just walked up to me and said, yeah, your kid was exposed to some kind of chemical in this freak accident, and it's going to stunt their, puberty development by several years, I would say, oh, no. I wouldn't be like, oh, that literally doesn't, like, that's nothing. That wouldn't be nothing. That's a thing. And it's a harmful thing, which I think anybody would respond negatively to hearing that news. So it's just not harmless.
A kid who decides that they're not trans can come off puberty blockers at any time and they're not negatively impacted at all. In fact, they get hit by puberty with full force as their body hastens to catch up. If they do
that sounds like it could also be quite harmful, but whatever.
Accordingly, her mother started to treat her as a girl and allowing her to socially transition and wear feminine clothes if she so chose. The father, on the other hand, rejected this, forced Luna to act more in accordance with her gender assigned at birth, and accused the mother of forcing some kind of gender...
Wait, what do you mean act more in accordance? So basically you had a father who had gross traditionalist ideas about gender and a mother who had gross traditionalist ideas about gender. What does this have to do with being gender critical? A father who's like, because you're a man, you need to act these certain ways that a man should act, or a boy. And then you have a mum saying, you're actually a girl, so you're going to do all of the girly stuff. These are two people who are basically two sides of the same coin. So what you don't have here is a representation of the gender critical point of view, which is you are a boy because of just biological reality. There's no way around that. You may have gender dysphoria. That's a mental health condition. It doesn't affect reality. Reality is you're still a boy, but you can express yourself however you like. That's the gender critical position.
So let's briefly talk about detransition, I guess.
Okay, now we're going to talk about detransition. That section on kids was actually pretty boring. Basically it was just, I mean, I didn't think there was going to be much of substance said, and there wasn't much of substance said.
Detransition happens, but is so rare as to functionally be irrelevant, and frankly is only really used to try...
It's so rare to functionally be irrelevant. Meanwhile, intersex! That's absurd. You can't say detransition so rare to be irrelevant, and then put this massive focus on this tiny, tiny minority of a minority of people who aren't clearly identifiable as either strictly male or strictly female. Like, yeah, that's a massive self-own there. Because if you're going to acknowledge this idea of like, well, if something's very rare, it can be considered functionally irrelevant, then good. In that case, we can just say the categories of male and female are clearly defined. Any exceptions to those definitions are so rare as to be functionally irrelevant, and boom, now the even pretty unimpressive criticism you might have had of biological sex as the reference for whether somebody's a man or woman is completely blown out of the water.
We need to understand and respect that the reasons why someone detransitions are often complex and nuanced.
I just want to say something, because basically Sheep has spent so much of this video dismissing any indication of like an article, or sorry, a news site or website which has a name which indicates that it is gender critical. So he's been like transgender trend, peaks trans, woman means something, dismissing all of these different sites based on the fact that they're biased because they are gender critical. But Stonewall, how is Stonewall any less biased? It's just it's a really strange thing to do, to be like, to have spent so much of it, and like basically anytime Sheep has brought up like gender critical sources, the main refutation Sheep has had is saying, well, these are from sites that clearly have are clearly pro gender critical, therefore they are biased and could just be ignored. And yet now Sheep is presenting this massive wall of text from Stonewall, and it's like, okay, I'm just going to ignore it like what you did. You know, if we can just ignore if we can just say, well, that's biased, ignore the actual content of what's being said, and just be like, yeah, that's just biased. Well, then, yeah, I guess we can just do that here. And also, I mean, this whole thing seems pretty speculative anyway. It's just saying, well, this is why it actually happens. It's because they're not getting enough transition or whatever.
Trans people make up approximately 1% of the population. That means that less than 1% of 1% of people detransition.
That's really funny, because literally you could say it's a minority of a minority, just like how intersex people are a minority of the population, and intersex people who have anything close to differences of sexual development, which is obviously what, you know, intersex, when people say that, that's what they mean. People with differences of sexual development have anything close to something that could be considered hermaphroditism or anything like that. So basically, again, it's a minority of a minority. If you're arguing we can just ignore something when it's like a tiny fraction of a tiny fraction, then it makes it even more absurd that you previously claimed that male-bodied doesn't mean anything, because apparently male-bodied means an awful lot, especially if we can ignore all of the fraction of a fraction of the cases that might really complicate what it means to be biologically male.
Let's not pretend it's a widespread issue or some kind of epidemic among the trans community.
Okay, so the detransition thing is, that was basically it. It was pretty much just saying it's rare, not really, I mean, the reality is ultimately that, again, the main issue is that transgender identities are bogus to begin with. So people detransitioning, it's a genuine thing, but obviously it's something which, it's kind of weird, because in some sense, she was talking as if like detransition is a problem. And in some sense it is. Obviously it's a problem that these people ever transitioned in the first place. But in reality, detransition is a good thing, because people acknowledging reality is a good thing, because the truth matters. But yeah, now we got onto what about the sports ball? Now this is interesting, because I'll just say this very quickly. This is the smallest section of the video. And what's kind of shocking is that there's a guy I know who is, kind of, he razzes me about the whole me talking about gender identity thing. Like, he kind of says, oh, you're a, like, he basically says I'm a transphobe, but like in a way where it's not like a really serious criticism. It's just like, oh, you're so obsessed with trans people, why do you care about it, blah blah, like that kind of thing. Like, not necessarily like that he's like angry that I have this opinion, but just, hey, why does it bother you? Why are you talking about it? Just, live on that level, that kind of stuff. The interesting thing is that I casually mentioned kind of trans-identified males in sports, and before I'd even finished the sentence, he got, well, yeah, of course, that's nonsense. As in, of course, it's nonsense that a trans-identified male will be able to compete in sport. Like, I was just like, mentioning, I think it was to do with the Olympics, and saying like, oh, there was this trans-identified male who'd done this thing. And it was like, well, yeah, of course, that's nonsense. I mean, obviously, biological males have a clear advantage. And it would be ridiculous to say that biological males should compete against biological females. And that's kind of the thing. Like, even people I know who disagree with like the actual concern about whether or not gender identity is valid, more so people who just don't think it matters, rather than people who like, because to be honest, there's actually very few people I know who actually think, yes, transgender identity is valid 100% of the time. What I do know is people who are like, I don't really care about it. But even those people still like, well, yeah, obviously sports, that's what really, like, there it's obvious that trans-identified males competing in sports is nonsense. I think it's obviously one of the strongest cases that gender critical people have. Like, at the end of the day, I would prefer to have the argument stick on, well, does transgender identity make sense as a thing? But in terms of like small victories, sports matters loads. Or rather, sports is an area where it's very easy to win this argument, because people watch a biological male who was a mediocre like swimmer in the men's league transition to being a woman and suddenly is the top swimmer in the women's league. People see that and they say, that's complete nonsense. And it happens all the bloody time. So yeah, let's see what's being said. I'd be really interested to see. And again, like, I think with all that in mind, it's so interesting that it's like the smallest section, the tiniest section of the video. And it's, addressing, so far, I don't think, obviously, like I've already said, this doesn't address the main important argument, which is, are transgender identities valid? But, a lot of the sections it's addressed have been, not really that important. And now it's ending on the point which I think is probably the hardest to defend. It's going to be the smallest section on it. So we'll see how great the response is.
I actually made a whole video about this a few months ago, but just to reiterate, this hand-wringing over trans athletes is almost entirely fabricated. It's not...
What? It's almost entirely fabricated. Wow. But what? That's absolutely absurd. Trans-identified males have won women's swimming competitions. How is that fabricated? It's literally, I know these people don't really believe in acknowledging reality, but surely there's got to be a limit.
Not true, and honestly, who fucking cares about this shit? The fact of the...
What do you mean? Who cares? The women. Oh, he's just such a misogynist. Oh, okay.
matter is that if a trans woman had been on HRT for a significant amount of time, they have no appreciable athletic advantage because estrogen fucking destroys things like muscle mass and bone density.
Okay, that's like again, it's a bit weird to say this is like harmless when it's like it literally degenerates your muscles, but whatever. The main thing is, why, first of all, like, okay, let's just imagine that's true. Well, at that point, are you a trans medicalist, right? Because surely, let's be honest, if you're going to be consistent about trans identified males in sports, then it should just be about trans identity. The absurd claim here is presumably this person is not a trans medicalist and believes that all that makes you a woman is identifying as a woman. That's what I would assume. And if that's the case, then why shouldn't any biological male who just identifies as a woman be allowed to compete in women's sports? The issue becomes that at that point, it's not really women's sports, is it? It's a certain amount of estrogen sports. It's like once you hit a certain amount of estrogen, once you get a certain amount of estrogen treatment, then you can compete in this sporting competition. Well, why don't you just make it about being biologically female? Doesn't that make more sense? It's just absurd. Like, I don't understand this logic of, well, biological males can compete if, because if they completely destroy their own abilities, again, it kind of creates a situation where it's like, are we going to make an argument that overweight biological males should be able to compete? Because it's like, well, once they reach a certain level of being overweight, they're no longer as good at the sport. And it's like, yeah, I guess that makes sense, but that's exactly the same as saying once they've had a certain amount of estrogen pumped into them, they're no longer as good at the sport. I don't really see this logic of biological males should be allowed to transition to women's sports once they reach a certain level of, not being as good at whatever sport it is, that, they're closer to the level that most biological females are at. I don't understand that as a piece, as like logic in general.
And let's be clear here, if trans women had to compete with cis men, then trans men would have to compete with cis women. And as we've seen when that happens, they fucking dominate because of course they do. Just to illustrate this point, I want to draw your attention to the simple fact that despite trans...
Okay, so I guess I'll just briefly address that. I actually want to make a whole video on that particular thing about the trans-identified female who was doing wrestling. It's an actual topic I find, kind of interesting just in terms of its implications. But basically the claim there is, well, hold on a minute. If well, here's the thing, okay, let's bear in mind, trans-identified females have no advantage over regular females because identity doesn't magically make you stronger. What you're talking about is females who give themselves huge amounts of testosterone. But here's the issue, you absolute plonker. Why couldn't a non-trans-identified female just start going on testosterone? Why is there a law? Why is there a rule against that? The reality is that there should be a rule against anybody taking performance-enhancing medication or drugs or anything like that. Pumping a female body full of estrogen, much like steroids, is very deleterious to the health of the person who is being pumped full of these hormones, but also, yes, gives them an unfair advantage. The reality is that this is a situation where we can very legitimately say, if you are a woman, then you and you want to pump yourself filled with testosterone, that's, I guess you could say it's fine, but again, I think you make an argument, actually, it should be a genuine concern, but you can't compete in sports. The assumption here seems to be that the argument is that if trans-identified females who have pumped themselves full of testosterone can't compete against biological men, they'll compete against biological women or biological females. But no, actually, what would really happen is they would be disqualified from sporting competitions because they've pumped themselves full of performance-enhancing drugs. There we go. It's pretty simple. The same way, and again, it's like, the whole thing's a bit weird because it's creating this completely sort of arbitrary association between hormones and identity, gender identity. And it's like, why are you assuming that association should exist? Why can't I, for example, as a biological male, decide, actually, I am a biological male, but I'm not quite, I identify as more manly than I am. And the way to overcome that gender dysphoria is to give myself more testosterone, like pump myself full of more testosterone, give myself more strength. Like, this is the issue. If you're going to say that somebody's dysphoria about their body can justify surgical intervention, and then also those people should be allowed to compete in sports, you're basically, again, just saying, well, people can cheat as much as they like. I can say, well, I wish I'm as strong as I am or whatever, but I have I have body dysmorphia, I guess maybe it's called, because I want to be stronger. So I should be able to take steroids, because I'm not comfortable in my body right now, and not being comfortable in your body is apparently a good enough reason to do all sorts of surgical intervention to your body. So yeah, I want to be stronger, so I'm going to take steroids. You can see the issue there. If you allow this idea that somebody wanting their body to be a certain way justifies surgical intervention to make their body that way, then you are basically just making it so anybody can really cheat as much as they like at sports. Whatever it is. Somebody can be like, well, I wanted to be better at this sport, therefore I pumped myself full of drugs that would make me better at this sport. How is that any different from somebody saying, well, I wanted to have, female breast tissue or whatever, so I pumped myself full of estrogen so that I would start growing it? How is that any different in terms of just the logic of, I wanted this thing to happen, so I had huge amounts of surgical intervention to make that thing happen? Well, I know I say surgical, medical intervention. It's just like a massive issue at the center of this whole thing. The reality is that what we really need to acknowledge is that any kind of medical intervention designed to make you better at a sport should disqualify you from that sport. There really isn't an issue here. Trans-identified females should compete in women's sports, and they should get therapy to, biological sex-affirming therapy to help overcome any gender dysphoria they have. They shouldn't do surgery to make themselves better at that sport than they in fact are. And if they do, then they should be disqualified. There's no big issue for gender critical people to overcome here. It's pretty simple, actually. You think you've got me in some kind of bind here, but you really don't.
Not one single trans woman has ever won a gold medal whilst competing as a woman in the Olympics.
So the basic claim there is that success at the Olympics is the litmus test for whether or not trans-identified males have an advantage in sports. But the thing is, okay, first of all, it's worth noting that I think there's only one trans-identified male ever competed in the Olympics. So, far from they've never won gold, I think it's true to say only one has ever even competed. So based on that, it's kind of like, I feel like maybe the reason that wasn't mentioned is because then you realize actually there's not a particularly massive sample size. But it's also worth noting that there's lots of explanations for why trans-identified males might not be in the Olympics, but it's pretty clear that they are dominating a lot of times some pretty high-profile competitions. So ultimately, this is still pretty clearly a legitimate concern. And the idea that when you see a biological male who was pretty average as a biological male suddenly becoming an incredible woman swimmer and totally dominating everyone else, the idea that it doesn't matter for those biological females who are in a race for second place, that it doesn't matter that they've now basically got no chance at all of ever being able to beat this biological male who has a considerable advantage based on the reality of being biologically male, I just think is pretty dismissive of some very legitimate concerns.
Sure, these ignorant arguments don't get spread farther than they already have. Transphobia, just like all bigotry...
Check out Grace Aditore, by the way, if you haven't already. I'll leave a link so you can check her out, because that's the person who Sheep has decided to just include as a B-roll here.
Uses the same arguments and rhetoric as racism and homophobia of the past, and...
What? Give an example. Give, like, a single example of how the same arguments and rhetoric are being used. Like, literally one example. Because you haven't given any example in this video.
Trans women are inherently sexually aggressive due to their gender assigned at birth. For example, you have to imply that so are all men, including gay...
Oh, poor men. Oh, poor men. You're such a loser.
How to spot a trans woman or whatever usually include things like big hands, tall, hairy, and so on. And these are traits that gender non-conforming cis women also have and are victimized by society for as well. And is the exact sort of issues that feminists...
Sorry, that's not true. Big gender non-conformity is about like the choices you make in terms of how you express yourself. Big hands, being tall, maybe you could say hairy because obviously like shaving, but actually the reality is that women who don't shave still aren't usually that hairy. Ultimately, but we'll ignore that for a second, because big hands and height aren't things that are affected by your gender non-conformity. Women, you can not conform to gender as much as you like. You're not going to get taller or find that your hands start getting bigger. So that's just inaccurate.
They accuse others of pandering to female stereotypes, whilst themselves pandering to female stereotypes and using them as an excuse to harm vulnerable people.
What? That's just not true. It's pretty boring just hearing like these claims made, and there's just no evidence for them at all. Like, what is your evidence that pandering to female stereotypes? What are you talking about?
Fuck TIFs, fuck transphobes, and trans rights are human rights.
Okay, that was pretty disappointing. I'm getting kind of cold. I got your scoop right here, Buster. Misogynist is misogynistic. That's the conclusion to this video. Overall, pretty disappointing. I think I probably will end up including some of my comments about other things I noticed, and I was like, oh wait, that was a really silly thing to have said. It's not going to be too much, but boom. Okay, so in the end, it turned out there was really only one clip I wanted to return back to, and it's when Sheep says this.
This definition is pretty bad, really, because it implies that femininity is defined and measured based on suffering and pain rather than anything quantifiable or that makes any sense.
So way back in part 2, the only issue I pointed out here is that the use of the word femininity didn't really make much sense, because it's clear in context that what Sheep is talking about is how we define whether or not somebody is a woman, or how we understand whether or not somebody is a woman, and says that it doesn't make sense to understand that somebody being a woman can be understood with reference to how much suffering or pain they've experienced. And all I pointed out is that femininity is not the same thing as being a woman. Femininity is stereotypical gender roles expected of women and the performance expected of women stereotypically. That's not the same thing as being a woman, and to suggest it is would be deeply sexist. However, with this in mind, I didn't fully appreciate just how bad and stupid this quote ends up being, or this argument ends up being. So I want to explain the 3 other reasons why this quote just makes no sense, or why this argument makes no sense. And the first thing that should be pointed out is that from a gender critical perspective, what makes somebody a woman doesn't need to be quantifiable. Something being quantifiable means being able to say there is a certain amount of that particular thing. So, obviously, something which can be counted. whether it's, height, for example. Height is quantifiable. But what you may notice is that something being quantifiable is only necessary if you are trying to put things on a spectrum. If you want to put things on a spectrum from, say, for example, short to tall, you need a quantifiable x-axis, which would be height. You need to be able to go, well, this person is this height, but this person is a tall height, and this person blah, blah, until you get up to very tall, if you want to put things on a spectrum. The way that man and woman are defined in gender-critical feminism is not with reference to, categorizations that are quantifiable, but rather with reference to things which are discrete, specific attributes somebody might have, and attributes which somebody is not going to have more or less of. The entire issue and the reason why biological sex is not a spectrum is because there isn't a quantifiability to it. Obviously it's been pointed out before that various differences of sexual development are not different degrees of each other. There is no x-axis that can be pointed to say, well, this is what makes you more of a male, this is what makes you more of a female. Rather, there are attributes which biological males can have, and there are attributes which biological females can have. A penis is not distinct from a vagina by a matter of degrees. It's not as if, you can go, you can slide a slider along to get from a penis to a vagina. No, they are fundamentally different things. And that's the key point. Sexual attributes and sexual characteristics aren't generally separated by degree, but rather by function itself. And therefore, it's correct to say that biological sex, which is how we understand being a man or woman, is not something quantifiable. But actually, it's completely ridiculous of Sheep to suggest that this is a problem for gender-critical feminism. It completely validates the gender-critical point of view and actually entirely undermines the idea that sex is a spectrum. So there we go. The first issue with this argument is that gender-critical feminism does not seek to find some kind of quantifiable attribute which can be used to understand who is a man and who is a woman, because who are men and who are women does not exist on a spectrum. Therefore, there's no need to quantify any attributes that men and women might have, such that we can decide to what extent somebody is a man or woman. You either are a man or you are a woman. That's the gender-critical point of view, and therefore there is no need for a quantifiable attribute to establish to what extent somebody might be a man or woman. Now, the other issue with this, and it's that's already kind of a massive issue, completely misunderstanding the gender-critical position and launching a critique which doesn't actually address the gender-critical position. But the other issue is just as bad, which is that suffering and pain is quantifiable, unambiguously quantifiable. There are degrees of pain. For example, having a penis is not quantifiable. And for example, it's worth noting there are things about a penis which are quantifiable, like for example, length and stuff like that. But it's not as if a bigger penis is more of a penis. There is more penis there, but it is not more of a penis. A 5-inch penis and an 8-inch penis are equally penises. And therefore, these quantifiable attributes don't make it more of what it is, because it just fundamentally is what it is. And of course, it would be completely ridiculous to suggest, for example, that let's say, as a penis gets larger, it gets further away from being a vagina. And as a penis gets smaller, it gets closer to being a vagina. That would be ridiculous. A penis is fundamentally a different thing from a vagina. But obviously, in that case, for example, we would say that having a penis is not quantifiable. But do you know what is quantifiable? Pain, suffering. We can talk about degrees of suffering, and you could, if you so wanted to, get every single human being in the world, or, whatever, over 7 billion now, probably more like 7.5 billion, and line them up, line every single human being up, and you could actually arrange them according to how much suffering or pain they have experienced. Of course, it's always important to bear in mind the distinction between epistemology and ontology. Obviously, it would be nigh on impossible to actually know the precise amount of suffering somebody's experienced in their life. You couldn't, and obviously you'd have to maybe even have an ability to see every single person's personal experiences from a objective perspective. The reality is, for example, I might personally feel that I have suffered more than an individual, but actually the reality is that there is an answer to which one of us has suffered more. I might feel that I've suffered a lot, But maybe if I had an objective perspective rather than my own perspective of, well, I didn't like when a particular thing happened to me. If I had that objective perspective, I would be able to say, actually, yeah, one of us has suffered more than the other because suffering is quantifiable. And that's the point. Ontologically, there is an answer to that question. The reality is that you can quantify human emotions. Of course you can. Of course you can say, the reality is that while you can get to the nitty gritty, the indication that these things can be quantified is that clearly, for example, there are innumerable people who have suffered far more than I have, and there are people who have suffered far less than I have. And likewise, there are people who have experienced far less happiness than I have, people who have experienced far more. There are people who have experienced far less anxiety than I have, and people who have experienced, almost every single human emotion. There are going to be some people who've experienced more of it than me, some people who've experienced less of it than me. Maybe there are even some people who've experienced the exact same amount as me. Although that seems kind of unlikely considering it's basically a continuous thing where even like just the slightest bit more suffering would make it, of course, more suffering. And that's the point. While you could kind of say, well, when you get down to people who are very close to each other, what exactly, it would obviously be difficult to say who's really suffered more. It's not difficult to say with confidence that, well, either they've suffered the exact same amount, or they've suffered slightly more, or they've suffered slightly less. The point is, what you're noticing here is that this is quantifiable. Suffering and pain is quantifiable. And it's just kind of hilarious that Sheep says, rather than talking about something quantifiable, you're talking about pain and suffering. It's like, oh, pain and suffering, because that's not quantifiable, is it? Yeah, it is. You can quantify how much suffering somebody's experienced. You can quantify how much pain somebody's experienced. But obviously we need to get to the third issue, which is, kind of two for the price of one. It's basically, what is it that Sheep's thinking of that is quantifiable, that isn't pain or suffering? Because maybe Sheep will come up with some kind of reason why actually pain and suffering isn't quantifiable. Like say, oh, well, it's too nebulous thing. But what exactly is Sheep thinking of that is quantifiable, right? Because Sheep seems to think that whether you're a man or woman being something quantifiable would make more sense. That's what Sheep seems to be implying, quite strongly with what was just said. But if that's the case, you will notice that Sheep actually doesn't then go on to give an example of what might be, something that is quantifiable. Sheep dismisses the idea of defining being a woman with reference to suffering, saying, well, suffering isn't quantifiable, but then doesn't offer up any alternative. And so that's an issue in itself, but the kind of final issue is that we all know what it is that Sheep actually thinks makes somebody a man or woman. Identity, right? It's whether or not you identify as a man or woman. And I suppose I should point this out, not that I think it really needs to be pointed out because it's so obvious. Identity isn't quantifiable. It's very much not quantifiable. To say, well, I identify as a woman more than you. First of all, it's important to understand, not only is it not quantifiable, it's not even coherent. Like, if, for example, pain and suffering, we know what that is. We know what pain is, we know what suffering is. So actually, you know what it is you're quantifying. Height, you know what it is you're quantifying. Identity, I'm not even sure what it is we're quantifying there. And certainly, if you were to ask me, to what extent do I identify as a man? I would say, what the hell are you talking about? I identify as a man because I am correctly identifying myself as a man by recognizing that I'm biologically male. There's no, to what extent do I do that? I'm not even sure, are you saying the confidence with which I'm saying I'm a man? Because I'm absolutely confident I'm a man. Because I'm biologically male. Are you saying the emotional attachment to the idea I'm a man? Well, to be honest, I'm not that emotionally attached at all to the idea I'm a man. I'm not going to say I'm completely there's no degree of emotional attachment to it, but it's not a very significant thing. And for example, I imagine trans-identified people, maybe their emotional attachment to the idea that they consider themselves to be a man or woman is probably much greater than mine. So I guess that would make them more men than me, if that's how you're quantifying identity. But of course, that's quite a silly way to quantify identity, because for a lot of people, the idea of, either confidence in your identity or emotional attachment to your identity, or just like some other way in which one can identify as something more than somebody else. All of these things are completely incoherent to most people. And yes, if you tell me that if a trans-identified female, for example, walks up to me and says, I think that I identify as a man more than you do, I would say, yeah, maybe I have no idea what you're talking about. And that's the point, really. Identity as a thing is not quantifiable. And even if you were to kind of come up with some definition of saying, well, it's quantifiable in this way, you would end up with wildly incoherent and counterintuitive results. Like concluding that, for example, if you relate it to emotional attachment, then you would find yourself in a situation where the people who are most obviously men, for example, biological males, are less men than people who are biological females, but identify as men because, of course, as somebody who just recognizes I'm a man, I don't have any strong feelings about being a man. I just am a man. And therefore, my attachment to the idea of being a man is far less significant than a biological female who's going to insist upon being a man and, claim, of course, that it would cause him great mental anguish and suffering to not be recognized as a man. So you end up with, that kind of counterintuitive conclusion of apparently I'm not very much of a man at all then, because I don't particularly strongly identify as a man. I would just say, I am a man. That's all there is to it. Whereas, of course, somebody who very is like, no, you need to believe I'm a man, clearly very invested in this idea, obviously identifies more so. But again, so if that's how you want to define identity, you end up with a completely incoherent sort of set of conclusions about who is more of a man than somebody else. The point is that, let's be honest here, identity is not quantifiable. So there we go. In that quite short clip, Sheep, first of all, misuses the term femininity, and it's obvious the term femininity is being misused considering the context of the discussion. And what Sheep means is whether or not you're a man or woman, or rather whether or not you're a woman when talking about femininity. So first of all, Sheep misuses that term, then seems to think that gender-critical feminists would want to quantify what makes somebody a woman, even though gender-critical feminists don't believe that being a woman is on a spectrum, and therefore there will be no need for gender-critical feminists to quantify it, then claims that suffering and pain, which, by the way, is not how gender-critical feminists understand what makes somebody a woman, but claims that suffering and pain aren't quantifiable when they in fact are. And thirdly, clearly himself believes in a definition or understanding of what makes you a man or woman, which isn't quantifiable, nor even remotely coherent. So there we go. I think that's a pretty substantial issue there, and you can see why I felt the need to return back to it, because when I was going back and editing, I was like, wow, I really did not give full attention to just how stupid what this person is saying is. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this little extra edition or little addendum, and I will now allow you to return back to the original recording. Bye. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that video. Please do like, share, comment, let me know what you think. Subscribe if you want to. And overall, you can check out my Twitter. You can follow that. You can go onto Gilded and maybe be there. Everything you can do. So I hope you enjoy doing it. I'm very grateful that you watched today. And I'll just say, if you'd like to give on Patreon, that's really appreciated. It helps a great deal. And I always appreciate it. And I'll just say thank you to my current patrons. In addition to the names scrolling past on your screen right now, I would like to give a special thanks to last month's patrons, Charlotte, Sambuca, and Skeptical. You're all very appreciated.